So there's been a lot of bad GMs in NBA history, but none worse than David Kahn in my opinion. David Kahn was the GM of the Minnesota Timberwolves from 2009 to 2013, and in those 4 years I genuinely do think he set the franchise back about 10 years. So let's start off with the 2009 NBA draft. He had the 5th, 6th pick and also had 2 more picks in the second round. With the 5th pick he drafted Ricky Rubio. I know a lot of people are saying, oh, he could have drafted Steph, he could have drafted Paul George, could have drafted Gordon Hayward. Ricky Rubio was expected to go like 2 or 3 in that draft, and the fact that he fell to 5 meant it was a no-brainer that the Minnesota Timberwolves picked him. But at the time, they knew that Ricky Rubio was going to go back to Europe for 2 years. So the Minnesota Timberwolves needed a point guard. So with the 6th pick, they had 2 choices. They could have picked Johnny Flynn or Stephen Curry. Stephen Curry was the better player. Stephen Curry was the top scorer in college that year. But apparently, Del Curry actually told the Minnesota Timberwolves not to pick Steph because he didn't want to play there. While you might give him a slight pass for it, I genuinely do think you don't pass on a player just because their dad says they don't want to play there. In my opinion, the Celtics should have kept the number 1 pick and taken Lonzo Ball with it because I think Lonzo's the best player in the draft, but let's move on from that. So, whatever, they picked Johnny Flynn over Steph Curry. That isn't really the worst thing that he's done. Later in that draft was probably the worst thing that happened. He picked Ty Lawson, so he picked 3 point guards in a row, and then traded Ty Lawson. Yep, he picked 3 point guards in a row and then traded Ty Lawson. If only he traded Johnny Flynn instead, he could have got more back and kept Ty Lawson, who was a very, very good point guard in the NBA until about 2014. I'm going to skip over 2010 for now because I think that was the year that summed up why I believe he's the worst GM of all time. But in the 2011 draft, he actually picked Derek Williams with the number 2 overall pick. Derek Williams was actually expected to go number 2 in that draft, and a lot of people thought he was actually better than Kyrie Irving. So again, this isn't something you can really hold against him, but in hindsight, he would have definitely picked someone like Valanciunas, Kemba Walker, Clay, Brandon Knight, Kawhi, or Jimmy Butler over him. But that's something you can't really hold it against him because this is just looking back in hindsight, and obviously at the time, Derek Williams was a much bigger prospect. And now we're going to go on to the reason why I think he's the worst GM of all time and not just any old terrible GM. Before the end of the 2010 season, he traded for Darko Milicic. Darko Milicic, before the trade, told David Kahn that he no longer wanted to play basketball and that he would ruin the team and he'd ruin the team chemistry. But yet David Kahn still decided to go through with the trade. Whatever about what I said earlier with Steph Curry, his dad saying he didn't want to play for the Timberwolves, Darko straight up said he didn't want to play basketball, which isn't something that should be overlooked. So the Timberwolves finished that season with a 15-67 record and had the 4th pick in the 2010 NBA draft. If you looked at their team needs, they had Al Jefferson as their star player, they had Kevin Love, so they really needed a small forward. And they drafted over need instead of talent. They picked Wesley Johnson, who at the time was the highest prospect at small forward position, even over Paul George or Gordon Hayward. So again, this is something we're looking at in hindsight and not at the time. So they picked Wesley Johnson to fill a need at small forward position. But what they did after that in the offseason is just crazy. So first of all, they signed Darko Milicic, yes, Darko Milicic, to a big contract. The guy who said he didn't want to play basketball, they signed him to a big contract. Even though he did have a solid year the next year, he was still being overpaid for not great production. And then they go and get Michael Beasley, who played the exact same position as the guy who they just drafted, which meant that Wesley Johnson had to play at the 2 that season, which meant he played out of position. But then what they did next was just crazy. So they traded Al Jefferson, who was their star. They traded him for Costa Koufos, who was a role player, and 2 first-round picks. So they then went into the next season starting Darko Milicic at centre. So then you go back to the draft, where they drafted based on need instead of talent. So if they knew they were going to trade Al Jefferson, if they knew they were going to sign Michael Beasley, they should have drafted DeMarcus Cousins, giving them a front court of Michael Beasley, who at the time was a 20-point-per-game player and still had star potential, Kevin Love at the power forward and DeMarcus Cousins as centre. And then if they'd kept Ty Lawson, they would have had him at the point. And then at the 2, they would have had someone like Wayne Ellington, who would have been a solid 3-and-D player. Not a playoff team, but definitely a team in a better state than what they had. That season, Johnny Flynn obviously was injured, so they went out with Luke Ridnour at the point, an out of position Wesley Johnson at the 2, Michael Beasley at the 3, Kevin Love at the 4, and Darko at the 5. Out of all possible scenarios, that was possibly the worst team that the Minnesota Timberwolves could have put out on the court that season. So they drafted based on need, then traded away a position where they didn't really have any backup. They signed one of the biggest busts of all time to a big contract, and then they go and sign a player who plays the exact same position as their draft pick. What he was thinking in that summer, I have no idea. And I do think that offseason, whatever about the 2009-2011 draft, we can look at that in hindsight and we can't really complain too much about it because no one really complained at the time of the draft. It's only years down the line. But the 2010 offseason for the Minnesota Timberwolves didn't make sense at the time and makes even less sense now. I've never seen a GM just be as incompetent as that in an offseason. And the fact that he traded for a guy who said he didn't want to play basketball and then re-signed that same guy the next year to a big contract sums up just how incompetent David Kahn was at his job. And David Kahn should never get another job as an NBA GM, and I genuinely don't think any team is stupid enough to give him another job. So anyway, that's the video. Thanks for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe.